So welcome everyone to our mid-year data report, and I'll just recap just so it's in the recording that there will be offering just how to enter data, a quick intro, and Jenny and will show you how to briefly um, in I'm blanking. To input your numbers into your system and for your programs. And then I will be providing volunteer trainings report and how you can access it to find your volunteers trainings that is now required by the state.
Okay, and I'll just say a quick hi before I turn off my camera. I'm Jenny Schlukebier with SiDSupport. And yeah, Sophie will start us off, and then I will have a section about the various reports in SiD. So welcome. Sorry for that quick bobble there at the beginning. And I don't know if Mary wanted to say a quick hi.
Yep. Just wanted to say hello. Welcome, everybody. Glad you're here today. Hope you get a lot out of it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And we can move forward.
So the agenda today is I'll go through the volunteer trainings and how to access your volunteer trainings through Literacy Minnesota. And then the second part of the webinar will be with Jenny, and she'll offer the SID data information. Okay. Okay. So the volunteer trainings records that I have, Mary will be adding the links to both of them. So there is two links to one is a link to the live trainings that volunteer attendees attended. And then the second link will be to the trainings that volunteer attended for recordings. So we have two options of the trainings that we offer. So if you don't find your volunteer on one list, maybe the recording, maybe check with the live one or vice versa. But how you would, so when you click on the link and you get to the spreadsheet, I shared it through a Google spreadsheet, so you should be able to um, select and choose the Find and Select tab at the top, and then you click on Find. And it's a fairly easy process. And then you would, if you can go to the next slide, Jenny. And then the next slide would be this window will show up, and you would just type in your volunteer that you are searching for to see what trainings they've taken with us. And then you just hit find all, and it should come up with a list with their name and then the trainings that they completed as well as the date that they completed it on. So all trainings taken by specific volunteers will show up, and I will get this list updated quarterly and sent out and be shared with coordinators, volunteer coordinators, as well as anyone else that would need it. Please just send me an email and I can update that list for you too. But does anyone have any questions for me? I know this list, if anyone has been attending the LANVEC committee, we originally, Matthew Miller, he did the list, and then, but it just makes more sense that literacy would just take on this because we are providing the spreadsheet of volunteers that have taken trainings with us. So now I will be sending them out quarterly in the newsletter. So I hope this is helpful for everyone, since now that volunteer trainings have become a state requirement. But that is all for me, for today. And I will be, unless anyone have any questions for me, I will be passing it over to Jenny.
I do see a
Oh,
question about how often is this list updated?
Oh yes, so I this list will be updated quarterly, so every 3 months.
And just out of curiosity, I'm Jenny with the SiD support. I'm just wondering, is it like the various core modules that you put in this spreadsheet that people do with, is that the trainings they do with you at Literacy Minnesota?
This will be all the trainings. Any trainings they've taken with Literacy Minnesota will show up on this list.
Okay, awesome.
Yep.
Okay, if there's no further questions, then I will move forward to the next section. Any other questions about that? Okay, thank you, Sophie.
Thank you.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about then the SID data. So how you get those training information that you can gather from that spreadsheet that Sophie pointed out, and any other trainings that you all provide, how you get that into SID, and how that then shows up on reports. And before I get too deep into that, I wanted to remind everyone about where you can find all the reports in SID and our help information. So when you go to SiD, any screen you're at, if you see there's the tabs across the top and there's one that says reports, if you click on that, you will see this screen right here. This is basically a really long list of all the various reports we have in SiD. And so when we get to the section where I'm talking about reports, that's where you're going to find them. And then also on every page in SiD, at the very far right is a help link. And when you click on that, you will get to our help center, which looks like this. And I especially wanted to point out our help center because today for this session, I plan to, I'm not going into the super nitty gritty of like creating a volunteer record or adding attendance. We just wanted to do sort of a quick reminder of how reports work, specifically how that training information on your volunteers gets entered and then shows up on reports. So we're not going into all the ins and outs of creating a volunteer or giving them attendance, but you can find that. We did a session just like that, just for the volunteer conference in December. So if you click on the SiD training and support section of this help page, that brings you to a page that shows all kinds of articles or links to recent webinars that we've done, trainings. So it'll link to the video, so you can find the video for that training that we did in December there, and any webinars of the last couple of years, actually. If they're still relevant, we will take down old ones when things have changed. But there's quite a bit of resources there, so I just wanted to point that out. And then also, you can see our email. It's kind of small right here, but our email address is sidsupport@literacymn.org. And any questions you ever have about anything SID, anything data, anything reports, you just email that helpline, and that goes to both Mary and I, and we do get back to you pretty quickly with any sort of requests. So I just always like to, occasionally I remember to remind everyone of those resources in SID before we get going. All right, so back to the topic at hand, and Mary just put in our email on the chat, so if you don't have that already. Okay, so back to the history items or the trainings that Sophie was just talking about. Those get entered onto volunteer records on their history page. Okay, so if you're familiar, when you're looking at a volunteer record in SID, if you, on the summary page, shows some basic information about the volunteer, but then if you click over to the history tab, that is where you're going to put in any volunteer trainings that your volunteers have attended. Okay, so to do that, and you also put in other information on this history page, things like their entry date, their exit date, what type of volunteer program they are involved in can be edited on this page. A lot of that info actually appears on their history screen after you've done their intake, because you ask that info at intake, and then that populates this page. But once your volunteer has already been created, you can go to this page to edit old information or put new items in there. Okay, so for trainings are a perfect example of a new piece of information you want to put on their record. So for any piece of history item, you go to this screen. The date is going to default to whatever today is. So if they went to a training a couple weeks ago and you need to put that in, you're going to want to adjust that to the proper date. Then you're going to select the history group. And there's lots of history groups here. You can see we have ABE volunteer training, which we'll talk about in a second on the next screen. But we also have program entry exit status. So that's where if a volunteer leaves your program, you're going to want to click that to select exit. And then after you've selected the proper group, the next pull down here, the history item is going to have the more specific item that you're going to want to select. And then for some of these history items, you might want to put in a comment and click save. So for the training, after you've looked at that spreadsheet that Sophie has linked to, then you can see which trainings your volunteers have done recently. Then you're going to, like I said, you're going to select the date. After you select ABE volunteer training in the group drop down, the history item is only going to show you this list of possible trainings. Okay, so in the case of your 12-hour foundations training and your 4-hour foundations trainings, I understand that you would be putting in core modules 1, 2, 3, or 4 because I think it's 2 modules equals the 4-hour training, 2 modules plus additional training. So what you're going to want to do as a program is you're going to put in the core module 1 on the date they took it, maybe put in a comment, that's up to you. And then if they do core module 2 the next day, you put core module 2. And even if you put in all the core modules that do equal the 12-hour training or the 4-hour training, you still also have to put in that they completed either the 12-hour training or the 4-hour training. Okay, so that's kind of highlighted down here in dark blue. So some of your programs, you meet this foundation training by using the core modules. And that's great, but you also have to add that history item for the actual completed module as well. I'm sorry, the completed foundations training. Are there any questions about that? Because I know that can get a little confusing. If not, I'm going to move on. I'm going to start talking about the reports that are available in SiD about your volunteers. And there's a whole bunch of reports. And one area of confusion I'm realizing exists is that some reports will run and count up the volunteers based on they count up and display the volunteers based on a couple different criteria. Some of our reports will pull and display the volunteers based on whether they have hours during that date range of what you have for your report. Okay. Some reports will pull volunteers and display them based on whether they are considered active during the date range that you are running the report for. And that's this setup here. And some mainly one report is going to run the list of volunteers based on whether they're currently scheduled in a class. And then finally, we have a couple reports that will run for all your volunteers. And then you can maybe, one of these I know for sure, you can filter then whether you want to only look at those who are active or if you want to just see every volunteer you've ever had in the world. Okay. I do see a question, and maybe I'll stop real quick and I don't know, maybe if Sophie would answer this. Does how to work effectively with Muslims go under targeted module or other?
Yes. So this is Sophie. Anything that is not a core, so core 1, 2 through 4 are core modules, and then anything else other than those are targeted modules.
Okay, and then would you advise that they put a comment then in maybe with a little description of what the training was in the comment box?
Yes.
Okay.
I would say they can specifically select target modules and then add in how to work effectively with Muslims for notes. That would be great.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so some of the reports that run based on the number of hours the volunteer, or that the fact that the volunteer has hours in the date range, are the annual volunteer report, volunteer hours, volunteer snapshots, volunteer demographics, and then the daily, monthly volunteer attendance in classes report. And we're going to look at a couple of those in a second. And then the ones that run based on their entry and exit status is the NRS Table 7, the volunteer required training report, which we're going to look at pretty closely today, the volunteer training, and then volunteers who have no attendance in X days. Those reports are going to run based on whether the volunteer is considered active based on their entry and exit dates. Like I said, the volunteer contact list is based on if they're scheduled in a class. And then we have a couple kind of general info reports that's just going to run all your volunteers. Okay, now I see one more question. Now some of the trainings do not offer a certificate. How does one prove they did it? This is a great question. I guess they'd be on the spreadsheet, or does that matter? Sophie, do you have a answer for that question?
Can you specify to which trainings that does not offer certificates? I do know that like if there is a 2-hour annual trainings that volunteer.
Okay. Oh, I was going to jump in, but go ahead.
Okay. There's usually the only volunteers that does not offer certificates are the annual 2 hours volunteer trainings to keep a volunteer active. So your program can provide that training for your volunteers. So that you just have to specify that program would support or program did provided the trainings. I think any other trainings provided through Literacy Minnesota, we offer certificate for all of them, C's and CUs for all of them.
Okay, that sounds good. Pamela, does that answer your question?
I would check in with either Megan or Kelly, and they would be able to provide you with the CUs.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right.
There was one more question.
Oh, one more question?
Holly. Yeah, Holly had a question.
I missed it. Okay.
I missed it too.
If a volunteer does core module 2 and core module 3, is that considered the foundations of volunteering for 4 hours?
Yes. So any 2 core modules are 2 hours each. So if they completed 2, that would be 4.
That equals the 4-hour one. But just a reminder, then you have to also put that in SiD. So it seems like an extra step, but that's what the report's looking for. Yeah. Great. All right. So and we're not going to spend much time on this report, but what I'm showing you right now is one of the reports that uses hours to display which which volunteers it's counting up and which volunteers it's counting their hours and how many of them were in your program during the year. And that report is called the Annual Volunteer Report. And this is one that's been programs have had to turn in for many, many years. You used to send it into Literacy Minnesota directly, but it has become a part of the August submission. So if you're on the manager side of things and you've been submitting reports to your program, you're familiar with the August 1st submission where they turn in level gain reports and budgeting stuff, I think. All kinds of stuff happens, gets turned in on August 1st. And one of those items is this annual volunteer report. And this report has a few pages. And on the first page, which is the only one I have a screenshot of here, counts the number of people. So it's going to count how many students. At that top half, it counts how many students were basically kind of worked with volunteers at some point, and it's basing that on the classes that got attendance, that where you assign volunteers attendance, then those students are counted up as having been getting assistance from volunteers. So that first page counts the number of students who've receive volunteer assistance. And you can see the second half of the same page shows how many volunteers did work during the year in the classroom. And it subsets them by the type of programming that they're involved in. and whether they're in a class that's a paid staff and the volunteers help out, or whether they are in a paid staff only situation, which actually is a little bit of an error. The second page of this, and we're not going to go into too much detail about this report because in addition to the training that we just did in December, every year, early June, we do another training where we really dig deep into this report and the other upcoming volunteer required reports so that you're really ready to turn them in, as they will be due. This one will be due August 1st, and then there's another one that's due June 1st-ish. So we won't go into too much detail today, but just so you know, this report counts up and displays volunteers if they had hours. If you put them in classes and you gave them hours, it's going to count those volunteers up, or if you gave them individual hours. And the third page of this report shows you if you have classes with volunteers in them that were tagged as paid staff only, kind of like this display. So this volunteer is chock full of information. And we do have a help article that dives deep into this report and where all the information comes from and how to kind of look at it and suss out what it's telling you. So again, that's one of the reports that displays volunteers based on the fact that they had hours during the reporting year. A couple other reports that will pull volunteers and display their information based on the fact that they have hours during the program year is the one called Volunteer Hours. And that's a nice little snapshot. You just run that report and it shows you how many volunteers are in the ABE category and the types of hours they have for a total number of hours, and how many are in the ESL category, how many are in the GED category. And it just gives you a nice quick summary of all the volunteer hours during that program year. And this other report is called the Volunteer Snapshot Report. And that too shows you, this one shows you, I'm sorry, the one above, if you do click on that little plus sign, then you can see the individual volunteers listed. But it's what you first see is the summary. On this volunteer snapshot report, it shows you all the volunteers. It has a little bit more information about each one of them. It has when they're first active. It has their last time they were given attendance, what site and subsite they're in, whether they're tagged as a paraprofessional or a teacher, and then lists again all the different type of hours they might have, and then their total hours. So both of these reports will run and display any volunteers who had hours during the program year. And then there's a couple others that I didn't highlight, but the demographic report will pull up those who had hours during the year. And then there's a report that is similar to reports we have for students where it lists all the classes and all the hours by month or by day. And we have one of those that's just for volunteers. And of course, it only displays those who have hours during the year.
Can we pause for a second? There's a
Yes.
question from SiD in the chat for Sophie.
Yes. So the question is there a separate spreadsheet for the list of the volunteers that complete the targeted modules? So SiD, unfortunately, there isn't. When we pull the data from our information, we pull it from Salesforce. So the list just compiles of everyone that has completed or taken trainings with us. So we aren't able to separate out like who took targeted modules versus who took the core modules. So you would just have to look through this spreadsheet, but it should show up of what trainings they've taken. You are welcome.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so the next way that most of our reports will pull the list of volunteers and then display them is going to be based on whether they were considered active or they have active status during the date range of the report. And a volunteer's active status is based on their entry date into your system. So down here on this example screen, you can see that's like the first item. If you're looking, the bottom of the screen is the older items, and the top of the screen are the most recent items. So you can see this was the first item put on this volunteer's record, which is their entry date. And that's because when you first create a volunteer, it automatically gives them the entry date of that date. And then when a volunteer leaves, you should come to this history page and give them an exit history item. Okay, so you would do just like you did with the volunteer trainings, select the date when they stop being a volunteer. This will be under the category of program dash entry exit status, just like it says here. And then one of the options over here would be exit. So when you properly exit your volunteers, um, then the system database knows that they were what window of time they were considered active. So if you had a volunteer, for example, who just started in July and then they already have moved on, I think some people do have short-term volunteers that come from colleges and things. They were active at some point during this program year. So then next summer, when you have to run your report about how many volunteers, the one of the reports that's based on whether they were active or not, it's going to consider that volunteer active because they were active. Sometime during that program year. Okay. So that's really important to remember. And it's really important to come through and clean out when volunteers leave your program to give them a appropriate exit date. Okay. Volunteers might come back. That happens a lot. And then you come to this page and you would give them a new entry date for that new time. And I think we've had in the past programs ask us, oh, we know we have some volunteers who are like snowbirds. So they go somewhere warm in the winter for a couple months and then they come back. Do I have to exit them and put them back in? And I think use your best judgment in that situation. Probably not. If you know them, if they've been around for a long time and they leave for a couple months and then they come back, you could probably just leave them without giving them the exit item. But for other volunteers who do indeed leave, definitely give them that exit item because that's going to make sure that your reports, which use this status, are going to be accurate. Another way that you can see the active status of volunteers is on the main volunteer screen. So when you're in SiD and you go to the volunteer screen, it has all your list of volunteers. It's usually ordered by last name, then first name. Then if you see the very, very far column is the active column. And it will have a check mark if that volunteer is currently, as of right now today, considered active. So they have an entry date and they have no exit date. Now you cannot deactivate a volunteer by clicking on this checkbox. All this checkbox does is display shows you who's considered active and who's not considered active. Now, what you can do is you can click the drop down and select checked, and then it's going to only show your active volunteers. So that would be a good way for you to eyeball your currently considered to be active volunteers. If you toggle this to the checkbox, and then you can look to see, you can scroll through your list and say, okay, are these volunteers active? And it even shows their last hours of attendance. So if you have some, like if you look at this one, this volunteer is active, but their last date of attendance was in 2021. So I might want to go clean up that record, and we'll talk about cleaning up records in a sec. Mark asked, is there a reentry button for volunteers? And there isn't. But that is a good question. I've had that question before. So let me write that down as a possible update. But that would be a kind of a little bit of a software update. Good question, though. There's a little bit less to update with a volunteer, so I think that's why we focused on the students when that was created. But that makes sense.
So when they return, if you have exited them, then
Yep.
you just enter them again, like
Yeah, that's
with
true.
a new date.
Yeah, you would just
right?
give them a new entry date. Just go to their history page and give them a new entry date as of whenever they just returned. Most of that other information probably with a volunteer won't change, but they might have, they might have a new phone number and address, and you'd have to do that on that info screen. So you kind of have to bounce around a few places. Whereas if we had a reentry screen, we could get it all in one spot. But yeah, Roz, that's correct.
And does it really matter? Like, for example, my team is really bad. They never take them out. So I go in January and clean that out, and I put them all gone as of December, thinking somehow the end of the year would look better. But does it really matter?
That is a good question. Yes, it does matter.
Okay.
And instead of thinking of the calendar year, you should think of the program year. So the program for all federal reporting purposes, July 1st to June 30th. So if they haven't been here for a while, you should give them the exit date, and we'll look at the screen that shows this in a second. You should give them the exit date of, if you do know when they actually left, that would be best. But if you don't
Okay.
know and you're working with some old volunteers, you should choose June 30th of 2024. So the last day of the last program year, not the last day of the calendar year. But if they were active during the fall, then December is fine. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That was what I was wondering, if I could go all the way back to when they actually left.
Yeah, if you know, but at this point, you already did reporting for last year, so you don't want to screw up last
Mess it
year's
up now.
reporting. Yeah, but if
Right.
you put that they ended on June 30th, 2024, then this year will be nice and fresh, and last year we can say goodbye to.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right, and then we have another question. Or would you just uncheck them and add them to a class in their schedule? Or check them. This checkbox, if that's what you're referring to on the screen, is not active. This is just a visible visual. Those with a check are considered active due to their entry and exit date. Those without a check must have been exited a while ago. So it's not something you can just do as check or uncheck them. And adding them to a class to their schedule will not change whether they are considered quote unquote active during the year. So it's very important that your entry dates and your exit, that you go in and clean up and exit volunteers who are no longer working with you. Okay. Nancy, did I get to your question? Even though the wording might not have been right? I'm going to move forward and hopefully we can get to that. Make sure that we're all on the same page here. Okay, here's another report that polls and displays volunteers based on their entry and exit dates, otherwise known as their active status. And then Nancy just clarified, you thought that just putting them, making sure they have a schedule on their, making sure they have a class on their schedule is what considers them to be active. No, but you know what I think you might be thinking of? With students, we consider them active if they have a class on their schedule. And that can be a point of confusion. There we go. Students are considered active if they have a class on their schedule. Volunteers are considered active if they have they have an entry date with no exit date. So that's a big distinction. And if you work with both volunteers and students, then yep, for sure, there's going to be some confusion in your mind. But the more I try to say this, hopefully the more it cements. Okay, because not all volunteers are always in classes. Sometimes they're doing one-on-one tutoring, so we couldn't base their active status on class schedule. But with students, it's very accurate that them being in a schedule, having a schedule, means that they're active. So try to think of it that way. All right, so the other report, and again, we spent a lot of time talking about this report during our early June session when we are preparing everyone for year-end reporting. But this report is called the NRS Table 7, a very boring report name. And what it does is reports all staff and volunteers in their various roles, whether they're administrative, counselors, or paraprofessionals. And it counts them up if they were active during the date range we just discussed, based on their entry and exit dates. And it will count up part-time, full-time, that's mostly in relation to staff, but then there's a column for volunteers. And up here, it will count those who are considered paraprofessional, which is usually the ones who are assisting teachers in a class. But if you do have volunteers who lead the class because they've been through that intense training, then they will show up on the teacher row in the volunteer column. But the most important thing I wanted to leave you with today is that this report will pull and display their information based on their entry and exit, therefore their active status. Okay. Finally, the new report that just became required this last summer. It's called the Volunteer Required Training Report. And this is another one that's due on August 1st. This one will pull people based on their entry and exit dates. So it's going to pull their information based on the fact that they're active during this date range. And then this will display all the volunteers that are considered active. It counts them up right here. So if this looks like an outrageously large or an outrageously small number, then you know that you might have some cleanup to do. It's going to show their name, their badge ID, whether they're considered paraprofessional or teacher, when they first started in your program, when you first put their record into your system. And then because some volunteers do come and go sometimes, they leave for a while and they come back, it will show their most recent entry date. So if you did have somebody who volunteered for a while, they were gone, you gave them an exit, then they came back, you gave them another entry, it's going to show that here. For most of them, it's going to probably be blank. And then if you do give them an exit, at some point, it's going to show their most recent exit date or their last exit date that you've ever given them. And then it's going to show whether they were considered active during this date range. It should be true for everyone. Although I think you can run this for everyone if you want, but it defaults to just those who are considered active. Then, speaking of the trainings we were discussing earlier, it will show whether they attended those trainings and whether you put a training on their history item. So if they attended either, or if they got credit for doing the 4-hour training or the 12-hour training, and you had put that on their record, on their history page, it will show you the date of that training. So this person went to that training on 8/12/2024, this person on 6/11. If it is blank, that means they have not been to the training yet. And then you look over here, sure enough, this person just recently started. So that makes sense. If it says exempt, that means that you selected the exempt dropdown. And then it can also say NA.
How long do they have to have been volunteering to be exempt?
Oh boy, I should know that. Sophie, do you remember the?
So they either the only time that they can be exempt is if they hold a TEFL or a teaching license.
Got
And
it.
then if they were a volunteer before October of 2021 and have completed training beforehand, they will be grandfathered into all the trainings.
Right. And in the case of the if they started volunteering before that date, I think it'll actually say NA as a not applicable. And exempt is if they have exempt for those variety of reasons, whether they have the 400 of training or if they have, I think, a teacher's license, right? So everyone should have something here. And if it's blank, then that means they have not done a training, they are not exempt, etc. And you should be, and if you missed the beginning, can you get a link? Yes. Like all trainings, we do record them and we will upload them with information. Okay, and then we also have columns for ongoing training because I believe every volunteer needs to have gone to an ongoing training every year. So those will appear here. And then if you put a comment for your ongoing training, then that'll appear here as well. We have a question from Leanne. Do we need to provide verification that they have a teaching license? And that's in order for you to give them the exempt? I don't know the answer to that, Leanne. Sophie, do you?
As long as they have a teaching license, I don't think you need to prove it. But I can definitely get back to you on that too.
I don't think that was ever necessary in SiD. I mean, and it could always be looked up by state if they were wondering an MDE licensure.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott.
Okay. So now I want to give everyone, let's do a quick activity. Let me back up for a second. I'm jumping ahead. Oops, that's not. Okay. So what we'd like to do is a little activity right now where I'm going to have you're all online, so you've got a browser. So if you can open another browser window and go to SiD and log in and run this report, the volunteer required training report, and take a look, see what yours looks like. So if everyone could go ahead and do that, and then what I'd like you to do is come back and chat in to the chat any interesting findings. And I want you to focus particularly, look at bullet number 2 here, focus particularly on that column of the 4 12-hour initial training or exempt column. And if you do have anyone that is blank or exempt, click on their badge ID and you can look at their record. It'll bring you right to their record and you can see if it's somebody blank, you can see, take a little closer detail. Oh, wait, I haven't put their training in yet. That I'll be doing that soon. Or maybe you have somebody who's been around for a while and they don't have their training yet. Take note to self. maybe I should make sure they've gone to training. Nancy has a question. Is that a question? You have somebody who has NA with a shared site? So I think what that means, Nancy, is you have a volunteer who is shared with another program. So they volunteered elsewhere for a while, and they volunteered before that date of October 1st, 2021, where they're sort of grandfathered in and they can show up as NA on this report, but they did that at that other site. So since that's another ABE program, and that other ABE program, they've been volunteering since before 2021, then they get an NA, even though they didn't do it at your program, if that makes sense. I have another question. I have a volunteer that needs both the initial training, because they started on 2022, and continuing training. Oh boy. And you know, Rachel, maybe they did the training, you just haven't put it in yet. So talk to the volunteer. I don't know how far back those spreadsheets go that Sophie is has out there as a resource.
It
Nancy,
should have.
okay, go ahead, Sophie.
It should have everyone that has attended all of our trainings up until now.
Since the beginning of time?
Well, that's a stretch, but yes.
Okay. So it does go back many years, though.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. All right, Nancy, good. I'm glad you asked a question about that. Actually, I think we just recently updated that. So shared volunteer information will appear on all programs who share that volunteer.
Did you say that TEFL was an exempt one, or is it an other? If you have a
TEFL
TEFL
is an
certificate,
exempt.
an exempt. Okay, thank you.
Yes. Mhm. But they will still need to have 2 hours of active trainings to be an active volunteer in the state of Minnesota.
So what would that be, that 2 hours? Just a class, I mean, short?
Yeah, so that 2 hours can be anything from any one of our one core modules or two targeted modules, or you can even provide it at your program, Ross. So you can do like just a training or update anything to relate it in the volunteer scope. You
Oh,
can use
okay.
that
So
as the
like,
2 hour trainings as well.
so for example, we require all our volunteers to do a in-house training at clues before they start. So that could qualify. That would qualify.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'm seeing other comments. Cindy, you've got 3 new volunteers who have not finished their training, so they show up at blank, which makes sense. And then someone else has another question. I have one volunteer, it's also part-time paid para for us. Do they still need to have volunteer training? Sophie, did you see that? Did they get training for their position as a paid para? I don't know how that works.
Paid para for us. Uh,
That might be a specific question that maybe you can touch base with, Shauna and
yeah,
Sophie.
I can get back with you. I can connect with you on that.
Sounds good. You have your paid paras do them, meaning you do the trainings, Valerie. You have them go to the trainings. Okay. And then Valerie, you had another question, which was, should we put administrative volunteers as exempt also? I have not thought of that question. I think it's a great one. To me, that makes sense. If they aren't in the classroom, do they need to be doing the same types of trainings? And if not, seems like they could have exempt. What do you think, Sophie? Is that correct?
So, if they are not working in the classroom, then technically they do not need the training.
Okay.
This is only for trainings is only for required for anyone who is teaching or interacting with, um, or teaching in a classroom with learners.
Sure. That sounds good. And also, when you create that volunteer record, you probably would select for them instead of paraprofessional, maybe administrative. So then that would show up on that line where it says paraprofessional for the state staff type. I would say administrative, and that'd be another clue that exempt makes sense for them. Yeah, click exempt and then put in the comment the reason why, administrative only or something. Okay, good. Looks like most people had a chance to run this report. We're going to move on. We're actually going to run it again in a bit. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, next is another report I wanted to highlight. And rather than this report pulling those who are based on how many hours or the fact that they have hours, or based on the fact that they're active or not, this report defaults to pulling everyone. So all your volunteers, maybe they were gone years ago, maybe they're current. It's going to pull everyone. You can filter to just do the active ones, which you probably even usually do. But this one does pull everyone. It doesn't filter them off the bat. Okay. And this one is called the Staff and Volunteer Information Report. And I think this is a great report for you to look at, to eyeball all your staff, to see who you might need to go in and clean up their data. And I'll show you why that works that way, which is when you run this report, there's these arrows here. You're going to want to go to at least the third page, depending on how many staff you have. But the third page is going to look at your volunteers. When you first run the report, the first page looks at your administrators, paraprofessionals. The second page looks at teachers. And the third page looks at volunteers. So now what's very helpful about this report to help determine whether these volunteers should be appearing as active or not is we put some yellow and red shading. So the yellow shaded volunteers will show you those who are considered active because they have an entry date and you have not given them an entry date, I'm sorry, an exit date, but they have 0 hours. Okay, so this is kind of a flashing red flag or yellow flag. Wait a minute, this volunteer has no hours, but they appear as active. So you're going to want to click on that volunteer and look at their record and see, oh, wow, yeah, they haven't been here a long time. I should give them an end date. Okay, and then we also have some with red shading. And this is only going to appear if you are running this for everybody, regardless of whether they're active or not active during the years. This is going to show you those who are considered not active. So you must have given them an end date. Let's look at this pink one. This person has an end date of last June, but they somehow have some hours this year. So red flag, something about their record needs to be cleaned up. Okay, they probably need a new entry date. Maybe they exited for a while and now they're back. So let's give them another entry date. Okay. So I'm going to have you do another activity, which is I want you to go run this report, the Staff and Volunteer Information Report. Make sure you go to that third page of the report and find a volunteer who is active, but they have no hours this year. So that's going to be one of the ones who has yellow shading. Then go to their volunteer record and look at their history screen. Do they need an exit status? Looks like I'm going to assume they do. unless there's somebody who just started and that's why they have no hours yet. If they truly did not volunteer since July 1st, you should give them an exit date. Go through this process. Make sure the exit date, as we discussed earlier, is the end of last program year, June 30th, 2024. Select the program entry exit. Select exit, and you exit that person. And let's see, we have a couple minutes. We're getting close to the end here, but I would like everyone to go do that and clean up. If you have a handful of yellow records, I want you to clean up like 2 or 3 of them right now. Feel confident. Go in there. If they have not attended, if they haven't been here as a volunteer since last spring or something, give them a 6/30/2024 end date. And then report back to us if you've done any. Pamela asks, couldn't those hours have been before 6/14? The report defaults to the program year. So this example report would have run from July 1st to next June. So if that person had hours on that example, they didn't have any hours since July 1st until now. So they might have had hours last spring, but somebody gave them an end date. Cindy asks if there are no records shaded, is that good? Wow, yes, very good. Rachel, you found someone, you cleaned it up. Love it. Got some good quality, clean data out there. Anyone else? I'm going to give people a minute or so to actually do some cleanup. Rachel was able to clean one up in a minute or less. Leanne had to clean up one record. Nice. And the more you get in the habit of, remembering to go in, volunteers are no longer coming. You remember to go in to give them an exit date that's very accurate and close to when they have stopped attending your program as a volunteer. Um, the easier this will be, the less likely this will ever be messy and have lots of yellow shaded people. I think we're still kind of cleaning up info. Now that this is required info on the report, that training piece, we're getting more and more, our eyes are a little bit more set on making sure the info in here is nice and clean. All right, all set in Duluth. Sean is also nice and cleaned up. Great. Okay, I'm gonna give like half a minute more for folks. And then we will move on. If you're still out there and you're cleaning up some stuff and you have a handful that you're going to need to get to, I would like to see who cleaned up the most. So if you haven't chimed in yet and you've done some cleanup, I'd love to hear somebody who's done 3 or 4 or 5. If you have a bunch that oh gosh, I'm going to have to come back and get to this, that's awesome too. Just make yourself a little to-do to come back and clean that up. Anyone else? Anyone do more than 2? Is anyone shy? All right, I'm going to move on. I really am just going to have you then go back now that you've cleaned up a few. I'm going to have you run that volunteer required training report again. The first time we ran it, I was having you look closely at the hours. I'm sorry, whether they had gone to the 4 or 12-hour training. You were eyeballing that. You were looking for anybody who was blank. You were wondering what the NAs meant. This time when you run it, look at the results. Does this look like it's showing the right number of volunteers for the year? Some of you just did a preliminary cleanup of those who are active or not active during the year based on their entry and exit dates. So this number might be different from what you saw when you did it 5 minutes ago. But for those of you who are familiar with your volunteers, scroll down these names. Do any of them jump out at you as somebody who is really no longer active? So even though we just looked at that other sheet that really shows you pretty quickly who is probably not active, this I wanted to give you a chance to look again at this report because this is the one that gets sent to the state and they're going to look at which of your volunteers, are you guys up to date? Are all your volunteers trained? Well, you don't want volunteers on this list if they haven't been active, right? You want this list to be nice and clean. So if anybody, all active and accounted for in Duluth, I love it. Anyone else? Some do need more training. Yeah, you might have some people who need that ongoing training, right? And again, once you get in the habit of making sure you're entering their training on their history record, this will be a nice place to go and just say, oh, I've got a handful of volunteers who need to get their training done. So this isn't only valuable for your once a year reporting. This report's valuable for you to also occasionally check in on and make sure your volunteers are up to date on their trainings. Leanne says, the one I had to clean up is showing as true. It's showing that they're active. Did you give 6/30/2024 as their exit date, Leanne? Okay, that sounds troubling. Did you rerun it or did you just look at it and it was still there from when you ran it earlier? You have to refresh that report. And if we're still in a kerfluffle, Leanne, you might need to send us an email and we'll take a look. Okay, you might have a quirky, did they have another entry date after their exit date? Maybe they had an entry date sometime this program year. Leanne, if we can't sort it out during this session, definitely send us an email with the person's name and we will do the detective work. Anyone else? Anyone looking at their volunteer required training report and liking what you're seeing? Is it an accurate reflection of your active volunteers from this program year? Do most of them have their trainings listed? Feeling good? All right. Oh, you fixed it. Leanne, I love it. I just gave a silent high five to you from afar. All right, and that's what we wanted to run through today. So if you have any last questions, we're here, and I know Sophie's still here to answer questions too, I believe.
Yes, I'm still here.
And again, like I mentioned, we haven't set the date yet, but the last couple of years we've done a training in early June to really hone in on the reports that are due June 1st and August 1st. Shauna would like a list of the required training for volunteers.
I can send you that. I can send you that afterwards, Shauna.
Awesome.
Can I have
Welcome, everyone.
This
Yep.
is Rachel. Hi.
Hi, Rachel.
Quick question
Yes.
regarding those reports.
Mhm.
Do they just automatically come to us every year? And how do you know they come? Or do I find them
Are
somewhere?
you talking about Sophie's spreadsheets?
Yes, yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I will be sending them out to the volunteer coordinator list that I have.